Good afternoon. Just a reminder about the lawn height.
Yes, ma'am. Finishing up now.
This is my spot. Ma'am, you can't park here.
Honey, it's a ticket.
Unbelievable.
This page shows the lot size and utilities.
And the HOA fees are here?
Yes, right here on this line.
So, what do you think about the proposal?
I think it's a great idea.
Yes, I'm on board. Perfect, I'll note that down.
It started as a quiet suburban morning in a tightly controlled HOA community where rules were displayed everywhere, but respect for personal boundaries seemed to exist only on paper. The neighborhood was designed to look orderly, with identical lawns, polished mailboxes, and carefully regulated parking spaces. Behind that polished appearance, however, tension had been slowly building between homeowners and the HOA administration led by an overly strict HOA CEO who believed control was the same thing as community harmony. The narrator had recently moved into the neighborhood after purchasing a house that came with a private garage. That garage was one of the key reasons for choosing the property. It was meant to provide security, convenience, and a sense of personal space in an otherwise tightly regulated environment. Everything about the purchase documents clearly stated that the garage was private, assigned, and exclusively for the homeowner's use. For the first few days, everything appeared normal. The garage functioned as expected, and the narrator felt reassured that at least this part of life would remain free from HOA interference. That sense of stability, however, did not last long. A neighbor soon began appearing in the space without permission. At first, it was subtle, almost dismissible. A vehicle parked briefly in the driveway entrance, then shifted into the garage area, just for a moment, as if it were a harmless mistake. But the pattern quickly became impossible to ignore. The same neighbor, who soon became known throughout the community as the HOA Karen, began treating the garage as if it were an extension of her own property. What made the situation worse was not just the repeated intrusion, but the attitude that came with it. There was no hesitation, no acknowledgement of boundaries, and no respect for ownership. The garage door would be opened without permission, space would be taken, and personal property access would be blocked without concern for consequences. The narrator initially assumed this was a misunderstanding that would be corrected through the HOA system. Formal complaints were submitted. Documentation was provided. The issue was reported through official channels, expecting swift intervention from the HOA CEO responsible for enforcing property rules. However, what followed was a slow, procedural response that prioritized internal review over immediate correction. Days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. The HOA Karen continued using the garage space as if it belonged to her. The HOA management issued generic notices, but no enforcement followed. The imbalance became obvious. Rules existed, but enforcement did not. As the situation continued, frustration began to replace confusion. Each return home carried uncertainty about whether the garage would be available or occupied. The space that was supposed to represent personal security became a source of stress and anticipation. The most troubling shift occurred when the intrusion stopped feeling accidental and started feeling intentional. The timing became predictable. The behavior became routine. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a pattern of entitlement supported by lack of consequences. Inside the community, whispers began circulating about inconsistent enforcement. Some homeowners faced strict penalties for minor violations, while others seemed to operate above accountability. The HOA CEO's leadership came under quiet scrutiny, though no formal challenge had yet been made. The narrator began documenting every incident carefully, collecting timestamps, images, and records of unauthorized use. What started as an attempt to resolve a dispute had slowly transformed into building a case for something more serious. And beneath the surface of patience and procedure, a shift was forming. The idea that this situation would resolve itself through the HOA system was fading. In its place was the growing realization that control over personal property might have to be reclaimed in a more direct way. But at this stage, no action had yet been taken. Only observation, documentation, and mounting pressure remained. and the garage, still being taken over without consequence, stood at the center of what was about to become a far more serious conflict. By the time the second phase of the conflict began, the situation had already moved beyond a simple neighborhood misunderstanding. What should have been a straightforward property violation had evolved into a prolonged test of patience, authority, and enforcement failure inside the HOA system. The narrator was no longer dealing with occasional intrusion, but with a repeated pattern that exposed deep flaws in how the community was being managed. The HOA CEO, who was responsible for maintaining order across the neighborhood, operated with a rigid procedural mindset. Every complaint required documentation. Every violation required internal review. Every escalation passed through layers of administrative delay that prioritized process over urgency. While this system may have worked for minor disputes, it was completely ineffective for ongoing property interference that required immediate correction. Meanwhile, the HOA Karen's behavior continued without interruption. The garage, clearly assigned as private property, was still being used as if it were shared space. There was no hesitation in her actions, no sign of reconsideration. Each new incident reinforced the belief that consequences would never come. The narrator began to notice something more concerning than the violations themselves. It was the confidence behind them. The repeated misuse of the garage suggested that the absence of enforcement had created a sense of entitlement. Instead of being corrected early, the behavior had been allowed to grow into routine occupation. Within the community, other residents started noticing inconsistencies as well. Some minor rule violations were addressed quickly, such as lawn adjustments or parking time limits, yet the garage issue remained unresolved despite clear evidence. This uneven enforcement created quiet tension among neighbors, who began questioning whether the HOA leadership was applying rules fairly or selectively. The narrator escalated reports through official channels again, providing detailed logs of each incident. Dates, times, and photographic proof were submitted with increasing urgency. However, responses remained generic. The HOA CEO acknowledged receipt but offered no immediate corrective action. The issue was repeatedly described as under review, a phrase that began to lose meaning as time passed. As weeks continued without resolution, the emotional weight of the situation grew heavier. The garage was no longer just a physical space. It had become a symbol of ignored boundaries. Each time the narrator returned home and found uncertainty about access, it reinforced the sense that ownership rights were being slowly undermined by administrative inaction. The HOA Karen's behavior escalated in subtle ways. She no longer treated the intrusion as temporary. There were signs of permanence in how she used the space, as if the garage had been absorbed into her routine. This shift marked a critical turning point. What had once been tolerated due to lack of enforcement was now being normalized by repetition. The HOA CEO attempted to maintain authority through additional notices, but these carried no real weight. Without enforcement mechanisms, the notices functioned as warnings without consequence. The gap between policy and execution widened further, creating a situation where rules existed only in theory. At this stage, the narrator began shifting focus from complaint to observation. Every pattern was studied. Every timing detail was noted. The goal was no longer just to report violations, but to understand the system's weaknesses. It became clear that relying on the HOA would not resolve the issue in a timely or effective manner. A quiet realization started forming: the structure meant to protect property rights was failing to enforce them. And in that failure, the responsibility for protection was slowly shifting back to the individual homeowner. The garage, still being taken over intermittently, stood as the center of unresolved conflict, and with every passing day, the situation moved closer to a breaking point where patience would no longer be the strategy. By the time the conflict entered its third phase, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had subtly shifted. What once felt like a simple property dispute now carried the weight of something deeper, an unresolved tension between authority, entitlement, an enforcement failure. The garage, still at the center of the issue, had become more than a structure. It had turned into a boundary test that no one in leadership seemed willing to properly resolve. The HOA CEO continued relying on procedural delays, reinforcing a system that prioritized internal documentation over immediate correction. Each complaint submitted by the narrator entered the same cycle: acknowledgement, review, and indefinite waiting. The process gave the illusion of action, but in reality, nothing changed on the ground. The garage continued to be used without authorization, and the behavior that caused the dispute remained unchecked. The HOA Karen, now fully accustomed to the lack of consequences, continued her pattern with increasing confidence. What had once appeared as occasional miscues had become a consistent routine. The garage was treated not as private property, but as an available convenience. This shift in behavior was significant because it showed how quickly boundaries erode when enforcement is absent. The narrator, however, had stopped expecting resolution from the HOA system. Instead of continuing to rely on external enforcement, attention shifted toward understanding control points. Every detail of the garage usage was analyzed. Entry timing, duration of unauthorized presence, and patterns of activity were carefully recorded. The situation was no longer being approached as a complaint, but as a problem requiring structural correction. Inside the neighborhood, subtle conversations began to emerge among residents. Some expressed quiet frustration at the inconsistency of enforcement. Others noticed that certain rules were strictly applied, while this ongoing violation remained untouched. Although no one openly challenged the HOA CEO, confidence in leadership was beginning to weaken. The system that was supposed to maintain order was increasingly seen as slow and ineffective. As time passed, the emotional pressure on the narrator transformed. Frustration slowly evolved into determination. The repeated experience of arriving home to uncertainty about garage access created a persistent sense of violation. The issue was no longer just about inconvenience. It had become about restoring control over personal property that was clearly being disregarded. The narrator began exploring the limits of ownership rights within the HOA framework. The legal documentation of the property was revisited. The boundaries of private garage control were examined closely. It became clear that while the HOA governed community standards, it did not override individual ownership rights when properly enforced. This realization marked a critical internal shift. The problem was no longer about whether the HOA would act. It was about how long the situation could be allowed to continue before direct corrective action became necessary within legal boundaries. Meanwhile, the HOA Karen's behavior continued uninterrupted. Her repeated use of the garage had become so normalized that it no longer appeared to her as a violation. This psychological reinforcement, built over time through lack of consequences, created a dangerous illusion of entitlement. The absence of resistance had rewritten her expectations. The HOA CEO remained focused on procedure, issuing additional notices that carried no real enforcement power. The gap between authority and action continued to widen, exposing a structural weakness in the system that was becoming impossible to ignore. By the end of this phase, the narrator was no longer waiting for resolution. The mindset had shifted from passive reporting to active preparation. Observations had turned into strategy. Documentation had turned into groundwork, and patience, once the primary approach, was slowly being replaced by calculated planning. The garage dispute was approaching a turning point, one where the situation would no longer be defined by HOA delay, but by a direct assertion of control within legal limits. By the time the fourth phase of the conflict began, the situation had already reached a silent breaking point. Nothing dramatic had happened yet on the surface, but beneath the routine of the neighborhood, the tension had matured into something irreversible. The garage dispute was no longer just an ongoing complaint. It had become a test of whether property boundaries meant anything in a system where enforcement was consistently delayed. The HOA CEO continued operating within the same procedural framework, relying on warnings, internal reviews, and administrative layers that stretched timelines without producing real outcomes. Each new report from the narrator was processed in the same way as before, acknowledged but not resolved. The system was functioning in appearance only, while the actual problem remained untouched. Meanwhile, the HOA Karen continued using the garage space with the same level of confidence that had developed over weeks of unchallenged behavior. Her routine was now fully established. She no longer treated the space as questionable or temporary. Instead, it had become part of her assumed access within the neighborhood, even though no such permission existed in any official documentation. What made this phase different was not the continuation of the problem, but the quiet preparation that had taken place behind it. The narrator had reached a point where reliance on the HOA system was no longer part of the equation. Every detail of the garage's access structure had already been studied. Every pattern of misuse had been recorded and understood. What remained was timing. The day the shift occurred did not begin with confrontation. It began with absence. The garage, which had previously been intermittently occupied, was now under a condition of strict control determined solely by its legal owner. Access behavior changed without public announcement or visible escalation. There was no argument, no warning, and no interaction. The change was structural rather than emotional. When the HOA Karen attempted to use the garage in her usual manner, she encountered an unexpected barrier. The space no longer responded to her assumed access pattern. The environment that had previously allowed her behavior had been altered in a way that made continuation impossible. For the first time since the issue began, her expectation of automatic access failed. The reaction within the neighborhood was immediate but quiet. There was no public announcement, but the change was visible to anyone paying attention. The garage, once the center of repeated violations, was now clearly operating under exclusive control. The shift was not explained through confrontation, but demonstrated through functionality. The HOA CEO was notified, but the situation no longer fit into the usual administrative cycle. The problem was no longer about enforcing a rule. It had become about responding to a completed correction. The system that had delayed action for weeks now found itself reacting to a resolution it did not initiate. For the HOA Karen, this moment represented a sudden collapse of expectation. The behavior that had been sustained by lack of consequences was no longer possible. The environment no longer accommodated repetition of the previous pattern. The illusion of shared access had been removed without warning or negotiation. The narrator remained focused on maintaining stability rather than escalation. The goal was not confrontation, but restoration of boundaries that had been repeatedly ignored. The garage now functioned as it was originally intended: private, controlled, and no longer subject to unauthorized use. By the end of this phase, the balance of control had fully shifted. What had once been an ongoing violation had been structurally corrected. The HOA system had not resolved the issue, but it was no longer relevant to the outcome. And as the neighborhood adjusted to this new reality, it became clear that the situation was entering its final stage. By the time the fifth phase of the situation began, the neighborhood had already adjusted to a new and unfamiliar reality. The garage dispute, once a recurring source of tension and complaint, had entered a different state entirely. There was no longer ongoing violation, no repeated misuse, and no expectation of shared access. The environment had been quietly but permanently corrected. The HOA CEO, still operating within procedural limitations, attempted to reinsert the situation into the standard review cycle. Notices were issued again, reports were referenced, and administrative language was used to describe what had already changed on the ground. However, the system's response no longer matched the reality of the situation. The correction had already occurred outside of HOA timing, leaving the administration reacting to something it did not control. The HOA Karen, who had previously treated the garage as an extension of her assumed access, now faced a completely different condition. The space she had repeatedly used without authorization was no longer available under any assumption or pattern she had relied on before. The predictability that had once enabled her behavior had disappeared entirely. The first surprise became clear through function rather than confrontation. The garage no longer responded to unauthorized presence in any passive way. Its access behavior had been fully restricted to the legal owner's control. What had once been a loosely enforced boundary was now a firm structural barrier. There was no argument, no warning, and no negotiation required for the change to take effect. This shift created immediate confusion within the HOA framework. The CEO attempted to understand the timing and cause of the change, but the outcome was already established. The issue was no longer open for mediation because the underlying condition had been resolved through lawful ownership enforcement rather than administrative approval. The second surprise emerged shortly after the first, and it carried even more long-term impact. The garage system had been stabilized in a way that ensured repeated unauthorized access was no longer possible under any familiar pattern. The previous loopholes, assumptions, and informal habits that had allowed misuse were no longer valid. The system had been redefined to prioritize absolute clarity of ownership boundaries. For the HOA Karen, this meant that the behavior she had repeated for weeks could no longer be recreated. Attempts to return to previous usage patterns resulted in consistent failure. There was no escalation point left within the HOA system that could override the new condition. Because the issue was no longer administrative, it had become structural. Within the neighborhood, reactions were mixed but noticeable. Some residents viewed the change as overdue correction of a long-ignored problem. Others observed it as a shift in how property rights were ultimately enforced when administrative systems failed to act in time. Regardless of perspective, the outcome was undeniable. The garage dispute had ended without formal resolution from the HOA. The HOA CEO's authority, while still officially intact, was now visibly limited in practical terms. The inability to prevent or reverse the situation exposed the gap between procedural control and actual enforcement power. The system had not collapsed, but its limitations had become clear to everyone observing the outcome. The narrator remained focused on maintaining stability rather than expanding conflict. The purpose of the changes was not retaliation, but restoration of control over a space that had been repeatedly misused. The garage now functioned strictly as intended, private, secure, and no longer subject to external assumption or informal entitlement. By the end of this phase, the two surprises had fully established permanence. One had ended unauthorized access. The other had ensured it would not return, and with that the conflict moved into its final stage. By the time the final phase of the situation unfolded, the neighborhood no longer felt the same as it had at the beginning of the dispute. What started as a repeated garage violation had evolved into a full-scale exposure of how fragile enforcement could become when authority existed on paper but failed in execution. The garage itself was no longer the center of chaos. Instead, it had become the symbol of restored boundaries in a system that had nearly lost control of them. The HOA CEO attempted one last effort to stabilize the situation through formal channels. Additional internal reviews were initiated, and procedural language was again used to frame what had already been resolved in practice. However, the response from the community was noticeably different now. Residents had seen too much delay, too much inconsistency, and too little action. The credibility of administrative enforcement had already been weakened by its inability to address the issue when it mattered most. The HOA Karen, who had previously operated with confidence built on repetition and lack of consequences, was no longer able to maintain the same pattern. The environment that once allowed her behavior had been fundamentally altered. Attempts to revisit the garage or recreate prior access behavior were no longer effective. The assumption that space could be used without consequence had collapsed completely. What remained was not confrontation, but absence. The garage stood unused by anyone except its rightful owner, operating under strict control that no longer required explanation or justification. The change had been fully absorbed into the structure of daily life in the neighborhood. Over time, even the memory of repeated violations began to lose its influence over how residents perceived the space. The HOA CEO's role in the outcome became a quiet point of discussion among residents. While no formal accountability process was initiated, there was an unspoken recognition that administrative delay had allowed the situation to escalate far beyond its initial stage. The inability to enforce early action had effectively forced the resolution to occur outside the HOA's direct control. This realization created a subtle shift in the community's understanding of authority. Rules were still present, but their effectiveness was now viewed through the lens of enforcement speed rather than written policy. The garage dispute had demonstrated that when systems fail to act in time, outcomes are no longer shaped by administration, but by property rights asserted directly by ownership. The narrator, meanwhile, focused on maintaining stability rather than revisiting conflict. The garage remained secure, functioning exactly as intended from the beginning. There was no further need for escalation, modification, or confrontation. The issue had already been resolved through structural correction rather than ongoing dispute. Within the broader neighborhood, the incident became a quiet reference point. It was not openly celebrated nor publicly discussed in detail, but it lingered as a reminder of how quickly entitlement can grow when unchecked and how firmly it can collapse when boundaries are finally enforced. The HOA system itself did not disappear, but its authority had been internally recalibrated by experience. Residents became more aware of the difference between policy and enforcement, between written rules and actual protection of property rights. That awareness alone changed how future conflicts were approached. In the end, the garage was no longer just a disputed space. It became a marker of restored order. The two surprises that had ended the violation were no longer seen as dramatic actions, but as the final turning points that re-established control where the system had failed to do so. And as the neighborhood settled into its new normal, one fact remained clear: the conflict had ended not through HOA intervention, but through the irreversible restoration of ownership boundaries.